Hello YouTube! So last week I talked about subjective truth and objective truth in the way that it related to science. Today I want to talk about subjective and objective truth in the way that it relates to history. The reason I want to make this distinction is because in science there usually is an objective truth that people are searching for. It's just that our subjective truth gets in the way or obscures us from actually finding out what that objective truth is. In history, interpretation plays a very different role to what it does in science. In science, when you're interpreting data, you're usually trying to find what the objective truth is. What is actually happening. In history, when you're interpreting something, you're actually trying to present the most likely objective truth. And the reason this happens is because in history, there might not be one objective truth that we can discover. Certainly there was a specific event that might have happened in history, but we might not be able to discover what that was because of the amount of sources that was left behind. If we don't have the right amount of sources that are easily accessible in science, objective truth is much, much harder to find, and our subjective truth reigns over history. This problem can be seen much more clearly in ancient history, where our sources are very scarce and it's very hard to reconstruct what actually might have happened. In history, finding an objective truth might not be plausible just because we don't have the data or the information that we need to reconstruct it. Of course there are events that we know happened. We know when World War II was, we know when World War I was, we know when certain buildings were constructed. But as you go further and further back in time, the truth gets more muddy and cloudy, and you can't find absolutely what you are looking for. I guess this is the reason that many people say, what can history give us today? If we can't find out exactly what happened in the past, why should we care? Shouldn't we focus our brains on more empirical sciences such as physics, chemistry, biology, things that can actually help us? Well, I wish to argue that history can help us understand ourselves, even if we don't know exactly what happened. When you look back through history and you examine the minimal sources we may have, you see people just like you and me. You see people who had desires, who wrote poetry, who painted art, who made wonderful things just like we are doing today. And it may be harder because most of the sources that we have in history deal with the 1% of humanity. That 1% that has all the resources and all the power. This can be seen in Egyptology, where 90% of the data we have is only from pharaohs' tombs. The other 10% of the data or sources we have is from normal folk, and there's very, very little about the lower classes. And out of that 10%, 90% relates to death. It's extremely hard to reconstruct what was the life of the lower classes in Egypt. And you can see this all throughout history. All throughout history, people concentrate on the powerful and the smart and those that have achieved greatness. If you even look back through our recent history, you'll see most of it concentrates on people such as Napoleon, Karl Marx, Stalin. Even today we're concentrating on the presidents and the prime ministers and what's happening up in the higher levels. Very rarely do you see in history, and very, very rarely are you able to reconstruct what the normal folk for. And I believe that is what is important about history. Not trying to find some big objective truth about what actually happened, but understanding not just the special 1%, but the small, normal people who were just living their lives, and who as a whole probably had more impact on history than the special 1%. When I go back and examine history, I'm not trying to find one objective truth. I'm trying to understand the human consciousness. To me, objective and subjective truth doesn't matter as much in history as it does in science. Of course it's important to know what actually happened, but it's also very important to understand how that happened, why it happened, and how it affected the normal people, not just the special 1%. There's a quote that says, "History is written by the victors." And I believe that's true, but I also hope that through studying history, we may be able to see how people can be underrepresented and forgotten. And we should not forget that. And we should try to remember and represent as many people as possible in our world today. That's what I get from history. I'll see you next week. Don't forget to be awesome.